So much of the writing advice I come across is absolutely wrong. Not only will it not make your writing better, if you follow it, it'll actually make your writing worse. So, how do you know what writing advice to follow? More on this coming up. My name is Wendy Dale. I'm a Random House author and the creator of Memoir Writing for Geniuses. Today, I'm going to talk about some common writing advice that actually is terrible. There is so much bad writing advice out there. And I start to ask myself, well, why? Where is this coming from? And I think there are actually a couple of reasons for this. One of them is the fact that a lot of people repeat the advice that they've been taught, but they don't interpret it in the right way. Show don't tell is just such a perfect example of that. Show don't tell is actually true, but it's only true in very narrow circumstances. And people apply it globally to their prose, and it makes their writing awful. Another example is the idea of using lots of emotion words. Well, I think this is coming from a good place because the person has learned that prose should be an emotional experience. And so they've made the jump to, well, in order to affect your reader emotionally, you should logically use emotion words, which is completely false. So much of the writing advice out there is not actually what you see in award-winning novels and memoirs. So I'm going to take some of the writing advice that I have seen out there, and then I'm going to see who actually applies this writing advice in their book. Is it Nobel-prize-winning author Toni Morrison, or is it Lynsay Sands, the author of the Highland Bride series? So here's the first bit of terrible advice. Show me how a character is feeling. Don't tell me. Here's an example of showing me how a character is feeling instead of telling the reader. The sound of the key in the lock finally had her lifting her head off the floor to look over her shoulder. Sand stared blankly at her mother's maid, who now stood at the door to her cell, and then she sat up with surprise. The abrupt movement immediately sent pain rushing through her body, but she ignored it and rasped out a confused, "Betty?" The maid's eyes widened with alarm. She put a finger to her mouth in the sign to hush, then peered anxiously to the sleeping guard slumped in the chair by the table outside Sand's cell. So here we have the sound of the key in the lock finally had her lifting her head off the floor to look over her shoulder. So there we have an example of showing, and the idea is that she's curious. She wants to know who's at the door. Sands stared blankly at her mother's maid, and then we get later on, and rasped out a confused, "Betty?" So she's trying to piece together what's going on. When it comes to the maid's eyes widened with alarm. Another example of showing. And here's really an example of showing. She put a finger to her mouth in the sign to hush. So the maid is obviously afraid. Take a guess what book this comes from. This is from Highland Wolf. So if you want to write like that, you are welcome to. However, I prefer the writing of Toni Morrison. So what does Toni Morrison do to let us know what her characters are feeling? Basically, she just tells us. Let me give you an example. She rolls down the window to tell my sister Frida and me that we can't come in. We stare at her, wanting her bread, but more than that, wanting to poke the arrogance out of her eyes and smash the pride of ownership that curls her chewing mouth. When she comes out of the car, we will beat her up, make red marks on her white skin, and she will cry and ask us, do we want her to pull her pants down? We will say no. We don't know what we should feel or do if she does, but whenever she asks us, we know she is offering us something precious and that our own pride must be asserted by refusing to accept. Okay, so there's no description of what these characters are doing. There's no she put on a frown. Is there any gesture in the world that could get this emotion across? I don't think so. So don't be afraid to tell me what your characters are feeling, just as Toni Morrison does so incredibly well here. Okay, I already hinted at this one earlier, but this is bad tip number 2. Use lots of emotion words. That will help your reader understand what your narrator or what your characters are feeling. So let me give you an example of how Lynsay Sands does this in Highland Wolf. Hope dying in her chest, Claret turned her uninterested gaze that way to see 3 men on horseback crossing the drawbridge. Guests arriving late to the wedding, she supposed unhappily, and shifted her attention toward the chapel, where a large crowd of people awaited them. The witnesses to her doom were made mostly of Macnaghten soldiers and a very few members of the Kerr clan. It seemed most did not wish to be part of their laird's betrayal of his own niece. The wolf, her uncle muttered, with what sounded like confusion. Claret glanced sharply back at her uncle to see the perplexed expression on his face, and then surveyed the 3 men again. Okay, so we got lots of emotion words in there. We have hope, uninterested, unhappily, confusion, perplexed, lots of emotion words. But did that really work to transmit emotion? Using emotion words is shortcut writing. What emotion words will never be able to accomplish is transmit that emotion to your reader. So saying he was sad or she was hopeful, that doesn't make your reader feel sad or hopeful. The way to transmit emotion to your reader is to write the thoughts that would have gone through your narrator or your character's head at the time if they were in that emotional state. So in other words, instead of saying he was sad, you would give us the sad thoughts that went through his head. And when your reader reads those sad thoughts, your reader actually becomes sad. So let me show you how Toni Morrison does this in Sula. She puts us inside the character's head. This is what she writes. Laced and silent in his small bed, he tried to tie the loose cords in his mind. He wanted desperately to see his own face and connect it with the word private, the word the nurse and the others who helped bind him had called him. Private, he thought, was something secret, and he wondered why they looked at him and called him a secret. Still, if his hands behaved as they had done, what might he expect from his face? The fear and longing were too much for him, so he began to think of other things. That is, he let his mind slip into whatever cave mouths of memory it chose. Okay, so we do have 2 emotion words in there. We have fear and longing, but she does use them as nouns. She's not describing he was scared, he was fearful. Overall, this feels like we are reading the character's thoughts, and that is how to affect your reader emotionally. Hopefully you feel the difference in tone between this writing sample and the earlier one. I would say that my favorite authors never use a single emotion word in their entire book. So you don't see sad, happy, joyful, upset. They always manage to convey it through the character or the narrator's thoughts. Okay, bad advice number 3. Describe emotions using bodily sensations. Oh, this is such a cheap way to try and get emotion across. My hands were sweating, my heart started pounding, and romance novelists love using this device. Let me give you some examples from Highland Brides. Gasping with relief as she made it off the last step, Lynsay Sands collapsed to the cold stone passage, every muscle in her body trembling with exhaustion. Okay, here's another one. Lynsay Sands swallowed the bile rising in her throat and nodded grimly. She would walk if it killed her. So swallowed the bile rising in her throat. Hold creeping down the back of her neck. She let her skirt drop and straightened, ears straining. At first, there was nothing. So there's not a lot of richness there. A lot of writers commit the error of thinking that, okay, if my heart is pounding, people will know that I'm terrified. But again, using bodily sensations is really about as effective as using emotion words. It doesn't transmit that emotion to your reader. Obviously, I tried to find an example of this in Toni Morrison's books and didn't. So let me give you a rewrite of the previous Toni Morrison sample that I read to you. I'm going to rewrite it the way a romance novelist might construct this same paragraph. There were butterflies in his stomach. He looked around for a mirror so that he could see his own face, yet a twinge of anxiety caused his hands to tremble. He took a deep breath and tried to steady his nerves. Finally, he gave up and lay back in bed, his heart pounding. So hopefully you feel the difference. That's my version, using lots of bodily sensations in an attempt to create emotion. But don't you think what Toni Morrison did was so much more effective? Bad tip number 4, use strong verbs. People love this advice. I think they love this advice because it's so simple. Oh, I just have to change my verbs, make them stronger, and voila, my writing is so much better. And it would be an amazing tip if only it were true. But you have to be really careful in applying this advice to your book. The problem is using strong verbs can actually make your writing feel insincere. It can actually make it sound hyperbolic. This advice is really well-intentioned and used sparingly. Yes, a few strong verbs can spruce up your writing a little bit, but you might be giving your book a meaning that you actually don't want. So I looked up the word walk as well as the strong verbs that might replace it. And I was given these three verbs: slink, saunter, meander. Now, the problem is slinking is very different than meandering. So yes, these are three strong verbs that might replace the word walk, but they have incredibly different meanings. So someone who is slinking across the room kind of creates this idea of someone who's not trustworthy. Someone who is meandering is very calm. It's a nice Saturday. The sun is out. These have incredibly different meanings. So just replacing a verb with a strong verb, you might actually be changing the meaning of what you are trying to write. Okay, so let me give you some examples from Lynsay Sands. Here now, Baron Monmouth protested, scurrying to his feet to chase after them as Rory led Alec toward the large keep doors. What of Fitzallen? I told you he had a complaint he wanted you to look at. I had no agreement with Fitzallen, Rory said, with unconcern, as he yanked the door open and strode out into the biting wind. It felt more like January or February than late November, and he could smell the promise of snow in the air. It seemed winter was coming early this year. But I paid you a small fortune, Baron Monmouth charged after him down the stairs. Okay, so look at all of the strong verbs in this. So we have protested, scurrying, yanked the door open, strode out into the biting wind, charged after him. So maybe they work here. Maybe he's very angry and these strong verbs help express that. You could argue that. I always think they sound a little bit fake, a little bit like the writer's trying too hard. And I always notice the writing, which actually drives me crazy because in a book that I really love, I don't notice the writing. I am just transported. So these strong verbs actually remind me that I'm reading a book. Again, you can use some strong verbs, but use them sparingly. Don't replace all of your verbs with a stronger version of them. You will often change the meaning of what you're actually trying to convey. So I'm going to give you a Toni Morrison sample, and as you might expect, it's not loaded with strong verbs. So I'm going to give you the sample, and then I'm going to rewrite it the way a romance novelist might write these two paragraphs. So here is the original, the Toni Morrison version. He fought the evergreen for a better look, hampered more by his laughter than by the branches. Ruth jumped up as quickly as she could and covered her breast, dropping her son on the floor and confirming for him what he had begun to suspect, that these were strange and wrong. Before either mother or son could speak, rearrange themselves properly, or even exchange looks, Freddie had run around the house, climbed the porch steps, and was calling them between gulps of laughter. Okay, so as promised, this is my bad rewrite. I replaced the verbs with strong ones, and see how it just kind of feels insincere. He battled the evergreen for a better look, vanquished more by his laughter than by the branches. Ruth leapt up as quickly as she could and shielded her breast, relinquishing her son to the floor and confirming for him what he had begun to suspect, that these were strange and wrong. Before either mother or son could consult with one another, rearrange themselves properly, or even exchange looks, Freddie had galloped around the house, ascended the porch steps, and was bellowing at them between gulps of laughter. That's definitely not my favorite. I would always go with Toni Morrison's original version. I hope you feel the difference there. So before I get to the fifth tip, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe or hit the like button. Also, if you'd like a free class on how to structure your memoir, click on the link in the description below this video. Bad writing advice number 5. Be sure to include lots of visual details. Well, guess who took this advice? Our friend Lynsay Sands, the author of the Highland Bride series. Here's a sample from her book with lots of visual details. Pa's thoughts died as she stepped into a small clearing. It was pretty, surrounded by a wall of tall, stately trees, and with a low carpet of purple flowers making up the ground. It wasn't the pretty picture setting that had Ha sucking in a gasp of air. Instead, it was the sight of her cousin, Fernella, sitting, sobbing, next to her husband's prone body, her dark hair a tumbled mess about her round face, her gown torn and disheveled, and a bloody knife in her hand. So we get lots of visual details there. It's very descriptive. So how does Toni Morrison describe characters? Well, she does this in an entirely different way. Basically, she doesn't show us them. She tells us what they are really like, and it works incredibly well. Let me read a sample to you. Except for a heap more hair and some waiting in his eyes, he looked the way he had in Kentucky. Peachstone skin, straight-backed. For a man with an immobile face, it was amazing how ready it was to smile, or blaze, or be sorry with you, as though all you had to do was get his attention, and right away he produced the feeling you were feeling. With less than a blink, his face seemed to change. Underneath it lay the activity. So we get a few visual details there, but the huge majority of this chunk of prose is actually subjective writing. Subjective writing is what a camera would not pick up on. It's interpretive writing. So the author has to interpret this character. And just because Toni Morrison is such an incredible writer, I have one more for you. I just enjoy reading these. Mr. Smith smiled through it all, managing to keep his eyes focused almost the whole time on his customer's feet. He wore a business suit for his work, but his house was no better than theirs. He never had a woman that any of them knew about, and said nothing in church but an occasional amen. He never beat anybody up, and he wasn't seen after dark, so they thought he was probably a nice man. But he was heavily associated with illness and death, neither of which was distinguishable from the brown picture of the North Carolina Mutual Life building on the back of their yellow cards. Jumping from the roof of Mercy was the most interesting thing he had done. None of them had expected he had it in him. So there's very little visual description here. This is mostly about what this person is actually like. Do I visualize this character? I don't. Do I care? Nope. I feel like I know who this man is. If you like this video, you might also like my video, Why Show Don't Tell Us Advice That Can Ruin Your Book. Or you can watch my video on what makes your book good. Be sure to like and subscribe. I will see you next time.